Israel is escalating the confiscation of Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank and approving new illegal settlements at an unprecedented scale. Its actions have drawn condemnation. But what are the consequences on the ground? And how does this hinder prospects for peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Israel has carried out the biggest land grab in the occupied West Bank since the signing of the Oslo Agreement more than 3 decades ago. The current right-wing government has accelerated the confiscation of Palestinian land to build new illegal settlements, cutting deeper into Palestinian territory. At the same time, Israeli settler attacks are increasing in frequency and intensifying. For many Palestinians, this means all hopes of a peace are dashed, and with them, the prospects of an independent state. So, what are Israel's plans in the occupied West Bank? And what are the implications of its policies? We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Michael Apple.
An Israeli bulldozer smashes down Palestinian homes in the occupied West Bank. More often than not, Israeli authorities say they were built illegally and expel one family after another. It's a pattern repeated with impunity under the watchful eye of Israeli police and soldiers. Often, Israeli forces are also there to protect settlers when they attack Palestinians, vandalizing their homes and driving them off their land.
We were living in peace, but since the Israeli settlers came 2 years ago, we don't have a life. Day and night we're thinking about them.
It's estimated that more than 700,000 settlers, or 10% of Israel's Jewish population, live in settlements in the occupied West Bank, all of which are illegal under international law. The UN and human rights organizations describe it as a state-sponsored land grab, the seizing and carving up of Palestinian territory. In 2002, it started building a separation wall, cutting off occupied East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. More recently, the Israeli government advanced its E1 plan for the construction of 3,400 new illegal settlement units, effectively dividing a future Palestinian state. And this week, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved another 19 illegal settlements, spanning the length of the territory from Jenin in the north to Hebron in the south. Under the current far-right government, the number of illegal settlements and outposts has grown from 141 in 2022 to 210 this year. Rights groups are also alarmed by the spike in violence. The UN says 232 Palestinians, including 52 children, have been killed in the occupied West Bank this year alone.
Settler violence has become an additional tool for Israeli authorities to kick Palestinians out of their land and bring in more settlers.
Recent developments haven't escaped international scrutiny. A joint statement by 14 countries, including France, Canada, the Netherlands and the UK, says Israel's action not only violates international law, but also risks fueling instability and could undermine the future of the Gaza ceasefire. The countries reiterated support for Palestinians' right to self-determination. But Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, himself a settler, is unapologetic about the expansionist agenda, saying it's aimed at thwarting the establishment of a future Palestinian state. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Ramallah, the occupied West Bank, we're joined by Xavier Abu Eid, a political analyst and a former advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization negotiation team. In London, Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former Israeli negotiator. In Tel Aviv, Yariv Oppenheimer, an Israeli human rights activist and board member of the Peace Now movement. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for your time. Xavier Abu Eid, 19 new settlements, bringing the total built under this current government to 69. How do you explain this and why now?
Thank you, Dareen. I think it's just a continuation of policy, not just because Mr. Smotrich is trying to campaign for the next Israeli elections, but also because there is a consensus within Israel that building settlements, it's not something wrong. There is no opposition to those settlements. We haven't heard any word from people that are supposedly in the center left in Israel against those settlements. They're actually even scared to mention the term Palestinian state. So in other words, you have the Netanyahu government going ahead without any sort of, first of all, internal opposition, and also without being held accountable internationally. So the question is, why not? Not why they are doing it now.
Daniel, you say this continued push for settlement expansion is simply continuity, and it's nothing new from one government to the next. So it's something that we've seen before, isn't it?
Indeed, Dareen, good to be with you. It's not a change in the fundamentals, in the principles. Perhaps there's greater transparency. Perhaps they're owning what they're doing in more coarse, abrasive language. But this is the story prior to the creation of the state of displacing Palestinians from 1948 to 1967. Before the occupation of West Bank and Gaza, Israel made sure that Palestinians who were expelled could not return to their lands, expropriated those lands, put a military government in place. And in this almost 6 decades since 1967, it's been a relentless program of settlement expansion. And that did not cease with Oslo. It's now intensified. The Israeli government is very clear, and it's not new, about its intentions. It rejects any notion of a Palestinian state. And of course, Dareen, it's not just the settlements. It's the entire infrastructure and matrix of control around the settlements, the military, the settler militias, the apartheid land use and road systems and infrastructure, squeezing Palestinians into ever smaller spaces, trying to remove UNRWA in advance of perhaps permanent apartheid and perhaps ethnic cleansing and displacement.
Okay, we're going to drill down into a lot of what you mentioned, Daniel, in a moment. But first, let me bring in Yariv from Tel Aviv. Yariv, is this the consequence of decades of Israel being allowed to do this? Just a moment ago, Xavier was saying, the question is, why not?
I'm not so sure that it's just the continue of the Israeli policy, because this right-wing government is the most extreme right-wing government we ever had in Israel. And not only that their aim is to kill the idea of the two-state solution, they have no one from the outside that will prevent them from doing that. In the past, we had the American administrative, all of them, Republicans and Democrats, that were condemning this kind of building plans and expansion of settlements, and sometimes even prevent it. And now it seems like there is a green line from America to do whatever Israel would like to do in the West Bank, not to annex the West Bank. President Trump said it out loud that there will not be an official annexation. But on the ground, no one is stopping Smotrich and Netanyahu from expanding settlements and creating new settlements in a bigger scale than ever. We have to remember that in the past, Israel made the decision also to dismantle settlements in Gaza, in Egypt. So it's not a non-return point. There is still an argument among Israelis about whether this is the right thing to do. But what we are having today is a right-wing government, very extreme, with the most extreme settler that I know, Bezalel Smotrich, that is not just the treasury minister, is also the minister responsible for the West Bank in the defense ministry, meaning that he has the authority to do what he's doing, and he's making sure that every day in his job, he is trying to prevent the future Palestinian state and making the life of the Palestinian in the West Bank miserable.
Okay, Xavier, Let's talk about what this looks like on the ground, because the design of the settlements and where they're located, is that significant? And also, how is this reflecting on Palestinians, not only daily lives, but their access to their own land and resources?
Thank you, Dareen. I think there are two questions in what you are asking me now. From one side, the effects on the ground are terrible for Palestinians in general. But here is something I would like to take from what Yariv just said, because sometimes people want to believe that there is a more extreme Israeli government and a less extreme Israeli government for Palestinians. But when it comes to Israeli policies on the ground, we've faced exactly the same for so many years. Now, perhaps now with the current Israeli government, what we have is that, for example, Palestinians can be just killed on a daily basis without any sort of investigation on the Israeli side. But still, we may wonder whether 20 or 30 years ago there was any sort of accountability for Israeli terrorists attacking Palestinians. That's on one side. So the effects on the ground, we can feel them. Farmers can feel them, but also people going from one place or the other in the West Bank can feel. Now, but the location of those settlements, I think it's very important, it's very relevant. For many years, when there were peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, an important part of the international community said, you know what, the Israelis are just building settlements close to the Green Line in areas and under any agreement will be part of a Palestinian state, something that I always disagreed with. But now if you look at the map, most of the 19 recently approved settlements are actually between the hills of the occupied West Bank and the Jordan Valley, trying to take over more than 30% of the occupied West Bank there. And at the same time, they are deep into cities like, for example, Jenin or Bethlehem, that before it wasn't the case.
Daniel, we've mentioned the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who, as we're saying, is a vocal proponent of settlement expansion. He's a settler himself. He openly boasts about, he frames settlement as a, quote, ancestral heritage and a way to block a Palestinian state. So is Israel's land grab policy a way to block a Palestinian state, in your opinion?
Yes, in a more overt way, but that has been the path for some time. I think anyone who suggests that a Palestinian state looked viable prior to Smotrich being in such a position of authority has not been paying attention. The key thing, I would argue, is to look at sequence. What has enabled Smotrich? How did we get to this place? And the answer, I think, builds on what Xavier just shared with us, which is impunity. Decades of impunity meant that the lesson learned by Israeli governments and by the Israeli voting public is that there's no real danger in electing a Smotrich and Netanyahu because the international community will not prevent this. And that is precisely what has happened. And this latest statement by 14, 15 states, the Israelis have been laughing at statements like this for decades. They condemn, they even might mention international law. There was an International Court of Justice ruling a year ago. They haven't implemented that. It talks about the responsibilities of third states. So Israel is used to words of condemnation. What it is not used to, because it hasn't happened, is substantive measures, is being held accountable, is costs and consequences and sanctions, which might have the Israeli public eventually say, this is too costly. There is now this additional red herring of annexation, as long as Israel doesn't formally pass a legislative act of annexation, it's okay. That's the game that was played with the Abraham Accords. That's the game that's now being played. In the meantime, Israel does everything which is in many respects, as if not more consequential than an act of annexation. The other thing you've occasionally seen is imposing some specific sanctions on settler leaders, on settler ministers, on settlement products. But that is also not serious because there is no such thing as a settler economy. It's the Israeli economy. Every Israeli bank is invested in the settlements, every Israeli company. So if you want to hold Israel accountable, if you want to challenge this reality, the address is the Israeli system, the Israeli state. Why is Israel still in international football? Why is Israel in Eurovision? Why are there not sanctions? That would be the way to address this, not mealy-mouthed condemnations.
Got it. Okay. Yariv, you said a moment ago that this is not official annexation of the occupied West Bank. But we know that the settlement plan, Smotrich's plan at least, includes legalizing old outposts and connecting them to larger blocks. And many say, look, this is seen, in fact, as a step towards de facto annexation of the West Bank. So do you think that annexation then is imminent?
It's definitely de facto annexation, and it's very clear, and it's making the life of the Palestinian in the West Bank miserable. I'm speaking with Palestinians on a daily basis, and I hear what is the reality that they are facing today. It's different than the one that they were facing a few years ago, much worse, and this is because of the government policy. There is still a difference between making facts on the ground, what this government is doing, and officially annexing the West Bank. I don't see Israel is capable of annexing the West Bank, especially after Trump just blocked it. And I don't think it will happen. And it's not going to change the life of the Palestinians, but it does change the attitude toward the West Bank of the Israeli, most of the Israeli citizens. I have to say something that I think is really, really important. Many Israelis may be supporting of the settlers, but they are not going there. When Smotrich is talking about so many new settlements, and is talking the truth, but when you look at the numbers, how many Israelis are going to live there? It's a very small number of people. They are very extreme. They are very violent. They are very ideological, much more religious than Zionists. But the number is not so big. Most of the Israelis will not go to live in these new settlements in the West Bank. So if there will be a day that there will be a deal on the table, these new settlements that now Smotrich is building will not be an issue on the negotiation, because the ability to remove them will be very easy logistically wise. Politically, it will be very difficult, or ideologically, it is very difficult. These are very extreme people. But when we look at the numbers,
can you just
and the
elaborate
houses,
this? What you're saying, I think, is important, right? On the number of settlers, you say that the majority of the Israeli public doesn't want to move to the settlements. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? And perhaps, do you have any of the latest numbers of the number of settlers that have moved or that have not wanted to move this year, for example?
Yeah, when you look at 2025 and when you look at 2024, it's really surprising. When you look at the numbers of settlers that are moving back into Israel or moving abroad, and you compare it to the settlers that are coming into the settlements, the number of the people that are moving out is bigger than the number of the people that are moving in. We are talking about 1,400 in the previous year. It's not a big number, but it's a trend. You don't see so many Israelis reaching out to these new settlements. This is why Smotrich is promoting these farms, agriculture farms, because when you have a farm, you can take over a huge part of the fields for agriculture, but you don't need so many people. You can have maybe 20, maybe 50 young teenagers that run this farm that is controlling a large proportion of the land. So on the daily basis, this is a very problematic phenomenon. But when you look strategically, still, most of the Israelis are not moving from the West Bank to the West Bank, and there are more Israeli settlers that are coming back into Israel than moving into the West Bank. Some of the reason for that is security. We have to say it honestly, because it's not a safe place to raise children in the West Bank for Israeli settlers, and also for Palestinians, unfortunately. And this is why it's not such a successful policy of Smotrich, because when you look at the big numbers, when you look how many people are going to live there, it's much more. It's much smaller. Only 4% of the Israelis are living in the West Bank, and most of them are living next to the border.
Okay, let me bring in Xavier, because as Yariv was speaking, you were shaking your head at some of the points that he was making. So I'll allow you to respond, Xavier. And also, speaking of the settlers, the presence of them in the occupied West Bank goes hand in hand with the violence that we're seeing against Palestinians, right, including attacks that occur on nearly daily basis. So do you think settlement expansion effectively enables violence on the ground?
I think they are part of the same policy, and now when we hear and we see and we live. By the way, I have been a victim myself of Israeli terror attacks, that what they are doing is basically implementing Israeli government policy, pushing for annexation and, of course, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Very few people speak about the dozens of Palestinian communities that have been ethnically cleansed since October the 7th, 2023 here in the occupied West Bank. But I think here, Dareen, it's very important to set politically where we are going, because if the question or one of the questions we're answering in this show is whether this is going to affect a future Palestinian state, I think that's the whole story. Like Daniel was speaking, there is an Israeli policy for every single Israeli government to prevent the exercise of the Palestinian right to self-determination. They are saying it openly. Now, the international community now, particularly Western countries, instead of addressing those issues and just issuing a few statements of condemnation, they are trying to make the whole dynamic switch into reconstruction in Gaza and reforms in the West Bank, as if we didn't have this huge colonial settler program continuing. I would really like to be a bit more optimistic and say, well, we Palestinians feel that there are more Israeli settlers moving back to Israel proper. In reality, what we see is more oppression and more attacks and more impunity. So in other words, when it comes to accessing our land, accessing natural resources, we are not part of this internal Israeli discussion. In reality, Israelis are not paying the price for committing those war crimes here in the occupied West Bank.
Okay, and speaking of the international community, Daniel, you were pointing out, rightly so, a moment ago, that even the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has come out with this ruling and said, look, Israel's continued presence in the occupied West Bank is illegal, right? But why is it in this situation that the international community, Western and Arab governments, are unable to apply the measures that exist in international diplomacy, like, for example, that they've applied on Russia when it comes to the situation in Ukraine?
Right. And Dareen, are we talking unable or are we talking unwilling? And the conversation has been really interesting, because I think we've arrived at this place where, how do we explain this disconnect? What Yariv shared with us is significant, that you take over land through the military, through the imposition and the designation of land as a farm, because you can't get the masses of Israelis to move there. So it's this kind of passive indifference, not actively going, but willing to see this carrying on. And you don't see Israelis, unlike over the judicial reform, for instance, or when the Israelis were being held in Gaza, you don't see Israelis mobilizing against this. And I would suggest that that is the point of disconnect, because Israelis don't feel that they pay a cost or consequences. We've talked a little about security. We have not talked, for instance, about why is Israel so opposed to an international force in Gaza that would actually protect Palestinians, deter Israeli war crimes, because I think they fear that that could then be replicated in the West Bank were it to exist. That would be a kind of deterrence. But the other kind of deterrence is this point, that Israel's allies in the West, led by the US, but also regional states, are not using their economic leverage, their diplomatic, political leverage, are not using Israel's involvement, whether it's in trade, arms trade, in international tournaments and competitions. They're not making the average Israeli feel that this is something that impacts my life, that I have to go out on the streets and protest about. And therefore, one has to ask, what changes this? How does one mobilize and push that? And how does one get people to stop pretending that there's some two-state dream around the corner in their statements? The reality is, of an apartheid state, an apartheid regime, I don't suggest replacing one zero-sum outcome of eradicating Palestinians with another where there's no place for Israeli Jews, but there should be no place for a system of ethno-nationalist, ethno-religious supremacy. I believe that, of course, would be better for Palestinians. I believe it would also better serve Israeli Jews and Jews around the world if that regime of ethno-nationalist supremacy were removed.
Right. Yariv, look, you've got some countries critical, right, of what Israel has been doing. Are you seeing that things are changing with Western governments speaking out, or are these just words and it won't lead to any action?
We need to add to the equation also the Gaza issue. And because the focus of the world is on Gaza, there is less motivation and less need of the foreign government to deal with the West Bank. And this is why we see that most of the pressure on the Israeli government in the last 2 years was on Gaza. Smotrich and the government took advantage of that, and they are making effects on the ground that were never been in the past. Things that were a red line, like building in E1 next to Jerusalem and the settlements of Male Adumim, that was a red line for the Americans. Now there is an approval of the construction there. And we might see a new construction coming very soon. And this is something that is also a reaction of the war. And we see that in Gaza, it's a very clear policy of the world. Israel cannot build even one house in Gaza, at least for now. This is the decision of not just the Americans, but the Security Council. And Israel cannot confront this. But on the West Bank, because most of the focus of the international community was in Gaza, it seems like there is a green line to do things that were never been done in the past.
Let me bring in Daniel. Daniel, go ahead. Yariv, hang on one second, because Daniel wants to respond to what you were saying.
Yariv, this has never been prevented on the West Bank because it's never translated. And your movement, along with every other Zionist movement, and this is where I appreciate much of what you try to do, but you've got to up your game. You have never been willing to call for those sanctions, for the moves that would actually constitute pressure. You use the word pressure, but the pressure doesn't exist. And it's the job of everyone who believes not only in a dignified outcome, but also in international law and basic humanity to say real pressure, actual consequences, not just this term that you throw up into the air as if pressure exists. It doesn't. We need to make it happen.
I don't think that sanction is a magic word. And I don't think that with sanction you can solve the conflict or you can prevent Israel from doing what it does. I think it's a mix of things that you have to do. And in the past, we saw that when the Americans, especially the Americans, but also the European, when they said no for Israel, so Israel stopped and even say free settlements and dismantled some of the settlements in the north of the West Bank. So it's not just that a sanction, not just sanction is a magic word. I think that what we need also to show, and this is something that is missing in the discussion, is some optimism. I totally agree with all what you said about what's going on in the West Bank and the atrocities and the war crimes and what Israel is doing in the West Bank. I'm with you, but I'm also looking at the other facts. For example, the fact that Israel are not going there, that when you look at the numbers, the number of settlers, there are much more violence, but their number is not growing rapidly. And we need to look at the whole picture. And still there is a room for the two-state solution. And this should be the goal of the international community and the people that believe in democracy in Israel.
Okay, I'll have to leave it there because we've unfortunately run out of time. We've come to the end of the show, but I'll have to thank my guests, Xavier Abu Eid, Daniel Levy, and Yariv Oppenheimer for all joining us. Thanks so much. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can always go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X as well. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching and bye-bye for now.